Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. We really trust that your 2022 is off to an excellent start and that the year has treated you with lots of kindness so far. My name is Marie van Wyk and I'm the Executive Manager for Strategic Alliances at LexisNexis South Africa. And it is my great honor to welcome all of you today as we host another of our LexisNexis Rule of Law Cafe virtual events. In fact, our very first one for 2022. The Rule of Law Cafe is a concept that's been introduced by our parent company, RELX Group globally, and something we at LexisNexis South Africa were very proud to have rolled out in 2020 and then later on also in 2021. To date, we have hosted several of these virtual events that has brought together the industry, advocates in the industry to discuss and deliberate on issues around the access to the rule of law. This morning, we are especially excited to be anchoring our first Rule of Law Cafe for 2022 around insights from the very first ever Africa Rule of Law survey. This groundbreaking research exercise has been one of the outcomes of a strategic partnership between LexisNexis and the legal professional platform Africa Legal to advance the rule of law in Africa and impact the work of legal professionals across the continent. Together in 2021, we set out to conduct a comprehensive research that endeavored to evaluate the strength of the rule of law in Pan-African countries. The input was secured from respondents in 24 separate African jurisdictions. And our sincere thanks goes out to many in-house counsel, private practice lawyers, members of the judiciary and government representatives who participated in the survey and shared their important perspectives with us. The result is the fascinating report that's been released and entitled Advancing the Rule of Law in Africa, the Trends, the Barriers and Aspirations for the Rule of Law in Africa from 24 jurisdictions. This report unearths where in Africa lawyers are most hopeful for the strengthening of the rule of law. Also what the greatest hurdles are for this and who they believe has the greatest role to play in driving forward the rule of law agenda. As many, if not maybe all of you will be aware, LexisNexis is passionate about its role as a champion of the rule of law. As a legal technology company, we have a very proud legacy of supporting the rule of law on a global basis. And at LexisNexis South Africa, in particular, we are driven by the vision of enhancing the potential of the African continent by advancing the rule of law. We believe the rule of law is the very foundation for the development of peaceful, equitable, and prosperous societies in which the law can be accessible to all. Everything that we do as a business advances the rule of law around the world. Through our day-to-day business, operations, products, and service, and actions as corporate citizen, we are working to bring the percentage of people living outside the umbrella of protection of the rule of law down to zero. We know that for the rule of law to be effective, certain measures must be in place. There must be equality under the law. All people, businesses, and government are accountable, and the law applies to everyone in the same way, no matter who you are. It's also important to have transparencies of law. Laws must be clear, precise, affordable, and accessible while protecting fundamental human rights. An independent judiciary is as important as it ensures equality and fairness of law between people and public officials. Accessible legal remedy. There must be access to timely resolutions in the court of law. We also believe very strongly that for the African continent in particular, if we can proactively enable and uphold the rule of law on the continent, African countries will be able to become more competitive and attract more foreign direct investments, thus enabling the continent to take its rightful place on the global stage. We are certainly looking forward to a very dynamic conversation this morning, and we are so honored to have some wonderful panelists with us. And also in our midst, we have this morning the head of Africa and strategic partnerships and resellers of LexisNexis South Africa, Winston Boykutsu. Winston, there you're on the screen now. Everyone can see you. And Winston would also like to share a few words with you just before we start the session. Winston, over to you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Marie. I think from all of that, it is one thing is clear. The rule of law is a key ingredient in bringing about peace, justice, economic equality and prosperity for any nation. And I think that it is in our hands to guide and lay a foundation for our future generations, our children. And I think that many years to come, when we no longer walk this earth, the generations that will be walking the earth at that time will reflect back and really be grateful and look at our deeds with pride for our contribution. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a robust and thought-leading discussion.
Thank you so much, Winston. To assist us this morning in facilitating the discussions, it is also our great pleasure now to introduce Jeremy Max, media personality and consultant who will be helping us to really unearth and unpack some of the important insights from this report. Jeremy has close on 40 years experience in television, radio and print, and until recently, he hosted television news channel ENCA's weekday lunchtime news program before stepping down in early 2021 to co-found a strategy and reputation management enterprise. Jeremy, over to you.
Marie and Winston, thank you so much indeed for inviting me once again to participate in such an important session as this. And I thought maybe this morning I would use my jump-off point as the United Nations Global Compact. And it says very briefly that governments need to have good laws. They need to have good institutions and processes to ensure accountability, stability, and equality, as well as access to justice for all. Those are important words indeed. What does this mean? Well, it ultimately leads to a respect for human rights and the environment. It also helps lower levels of corruption and instances of violent conflict. A strong rule of law, says the United Nations, includes clearly written and easily accessible laws that create certainty and enforceability of legal rights. It goes on to say an independent and impartial judiciary that promotes fairness and ensures transparent, timely, and predictable resolution of dispute. And finally, effective and efficient public institutions that empower business and individuals to make a positive contribution to the economy and society at large. And I hope those lofty ideals, colleagues, informs our discussion today. I want to welcome our august panelists today, and the way in which we'll do them is I will introduce all of them. They will say a few words. We'll have a brief conversation, and then I will open the panel to the entire group. So our panelists are Melanie Ramalo, Sales and Marketing Director at LexisNexis in South Africa. Melanie, always good to see you, and thank you for joining us, along with Brenda Mutale Chanda, Co-Managing Partner at Moira Mukuka in Zambia. Brenda, it's good to see you. I would also like to welcome Aisha Abdallah, Partner Disputes at Anjawala and Kana in Kenya. And finally, Judith Kagere, who's Junior Associate at KTA Advocates in Uganda. So let's get straight to it if we can. And Melanie, I am going to start with you. So let's bring you into the conversation. You've got close on 30 years experience and have managed teams across Africa. Your largest portfolio, Mel, is just over 2,000 employees. I've said you're the sales and marketing director at LexisNexis in South Africa. You have a strategic responsibility to deliver customer value through intelligent data analytics, improve customer experience, and also critically a modern and digitized marketing department. That's the background. But let me say this as well. You're also, the organization is also vocal and passionate about the fact that the company's purpose is to advance the rule of law in order to create meaningful impact across the African continent. So Melanie, let's start with you. Why is that an important vision for the South African business?
Good morning to everybody, and good morning, Jeremy, and thank you for that introduction. Well, for us, as you know, we are passionate about driving and advancing the rule of law around the world. It's a concept that unifies our company across the globe and is passionately supported by the people of LexisNexis. We serve customers in more than 160 countries with 10,400 employees worldwide. At LexisNexis South Africa, our vision is indeed in enhancing the potential of the African continent by advancing the rule of law. Inherent in that is the fact that we believe the African continent has a huge potential and that the advancement of the rule of law on the continent plays a major role in manifesting that potential. The paradigm has definitely shifted from should we invest in Africa to managing the risk of not being in Africa. As an example, Jeremy, the LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation was launched in 2019, something we are very proud of as an organization globally. It is a non-profit entity through which LexisNexis seeks out and shapes projects with key partners to drive the rule of law globally. African projects include the LexisNexis property kiosk and so forth. And if you go to our website, www.lexisnexis.co.za news, you will see many articles to this foundation. We use our unique understanding of the importance of the business role and responsibilities, along with those of other traditional rule of law actors, to create meaningful, sustainable change in local, national, regional, and global projects, which generally enhances the key elements of the rule of law. We believe that Africa's potential can be better unlocked if government and the private sector continue to partner on initiatives to strengthen the rule of law. From a global perspective, the rule of law provides a legal foundation for conducting business in a reliable and very much a predictable manner. And we hold people, businesses, and government accountable for their actions. At large, as a multinational company, we believe in the businesses in Africa do have the power and the opportunity to innovate, disrupt, and leapfrog themselves and the continent into prosperity. So we're very excited, and we know that there's staying power in the local knowledge of the continent. This includes having access to the most up-to-date, I would say, country-specific tax, legal, regulatory content, because that's what we stand for in technology solutions to guide businesses' work and transactions in Africa. And of course, Jeremy, that's where we're stepping, not just through the South African operation, but also through our dedicated Africa region and globally. Thank you, Jeremy.
Melanie, let me follow that up if I can. These are all big issues that you have raised, and they are important contributory factors to the rule of law. But we also know that civil and political unrest remains a common thread across many parts of the continent. South Africa, this country where you and I both sit today, notwithstanding, need I refer you to the rioting and the insurrective violence that occurred in July last year. So as far as LexisNexis is concerned, what are your perceptions then? What are the company's perceptions of the current state of the rule of law? And I'm assuming there are both worrying threats, but also opportunities within an environment that is often unstable?
Yes, Jeremy, thank you for that question. Yeah, of course, it's been something that we've been driving from our organization perspective. And as you know, recently there's been studies as the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index 2021 that have shown that the rule of law is under threat, not just in Africa, but across the world. But we are of the belief that this is also an opportunity, which is why we are here today. In the last year, 23 out of 31 countries declined in the sub-Saharan Africa. And this is also due, I would think, and I believe, COVID-19. Of those 23 countries, 16 had also declined in the previous year. You know, there's so much of political instability we see across the continent due to the socio-economic challenges, the poor service delivery, Jeremy, extreme poverty, economic stagnation, high unemployment, and should I go on, environmental degradation, among other factors. We can just see how the weather patterns are also changing across the world. But adherence to the rule of law is and will always be essential for attracting businesses and investment into a jurisdiction, which is why I'm so excited. There's opportunity as much as there's threat. Without the rule of law, economies will have a hard time developing, and the citizens of the nations will continue to suffer disproportionately. We can agree, me and you and the panel today, that there's much that governments can and must do to improve the fitness of Africa's economies, but including accelerating infrastructure development, deepening regional integration, I believe, in creating tomorrow's talent, and ensuring healthy urbanization. But we also carry a responsibility as the private sector. As a role we play, it's important. And large companies, both African owned and globally, must be at the center and in front of it in the continent's march towards prosperity for all. Here's an opportunity for the private sector to work with government, to partner with them, which is certainly what we do, and it is part of our vision to assist in addressing these issues, promote inclusivity around development, reduce inequalities that we are seeing, and tackle unemployment across the world and across the continent, especially Africa and South Africa. And especially in these last 18 months that we've seen the pandemic just impact unemployment as well, and bridge the gaps, which we will lead to the unearthing of massive potential on the continent, which lead to gains for all stakeholders, Jeremy. And thank you.
All right, Melanie, thank you very much indeed. I'll get back to you in a moment, but I want to give you a few more details now on our second panelist, Brenda Mutale-Chanda, one of Zambia's top business lawyers and is co-managing partner at Moira Mukuka Legal Practitioners. Brenda, welcome to the conversation. Let's look at hurdles as far as the rule of law is concerned, as far as the continent is concerned. When it comes to the advancement of the rule of law across Africa, where are the problems? Where are the hurdles in your opinion?
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. I believe the biggest hurdle to the rule of law is corruption on the continent. It's also weak democratic institutions, which among them can be the judiciary, the legislature, and other institutions that are created by the Constitution to participate in the democratic process of the country. So primarily, I see corruption as the biggest hurdle to the rule of law on the continent.
So if we look at the survey itself, and I'm just looking at the graphs in front of me, that view is endorsed by the survey. Corruption, you've referenced government inefficiency, lack of transparency and accountability, lack of awareness. We can get to that a little bit later. And something which is also worrying is a lack of motivation to change. But you absolutely nail corruption as the top issue as far as hurdles are concerned. So when it comes to tackling something like that, Brenda, where does the responsibility lie for addressing these challenges and advancing the rule of law on the continent? It's not just a governmental responsibility, isn't it? It's a multifaceted societal approach.
Yes, definitely, Jeremy. I should say from the start that government should definitely lead, because their mandate is such that they have the responsibility to create the democratic institutions and the various institutions that help in the governance of the country. But I should agree with you and say that every sector of the country is supposed to participate in enhancing and maintaining the rule of law. So for instance, the legislature is a key participant, the judiciary is a key participant, and of course the executive and other institutions that are created, especially by the Constitution, in the advancement of the rule of law. It's the ideal situation is that everyone should participate, including private citizens. But it sometimes happens that certain institutions may not be as strong at any given time. So you find that other institutions will be strong and push for the rule of law. And sometimes it's just individuals, that come up and advance the rule of law. So the ideal, yes, is that everyone should participate, but practically, we see that some institutions may be weakened and others may be strong. And maybe I can give an example from my own country. So as some of you may be aware, Zambia went through an election last year in August. But prior to that, the government was different. There is a new government in place. And we saw that under the previous regime, there were some institutions, despite pressure from the executive, which were weakened, and others which remained strong. So I'll give you an example. There was a perception, for instance, that the Constitutional Court was not, they were not acting according to the rule of law, and this was reflected in some of the judgments that they passed. That notwithstanding, private citizens were able to, to take up issues to the Constitutional Court and demand for an interpretation of certain articles in the Constitution. An example was a challenge that was launched by a foundation called Chapter 1, which is led by Linda Kasonde. Linda Kasonde is former president of the Law Association of Zambia, which is the bar association. And after ceasing to be president of LAS, she formed an association called Chapter 1 Foundation. So Chapter 1 Foundation was able to take up significantly 3 cases with the Constitutional Court. One of them was to challenge the continued stay of ministers in office after Parliament had been dissolved, and she really was asking the Constitutional Court to find that their continued stay beyond the dissolution of government was illegal. And thankfully, at this time, the Constitutional Court was able to agree and did rule that the ministers had stayed in office illegally and should refund whatever payments were made to them, beyond the time that Parliament was dissolved. Another challenge was the eligibility for the former president to be nominated for re-election as president. And the argument there was that he had already served 2 terms as prescribed by the Constitution, and that he wasn't eligible to contest the last election. Of course, the court did not agree, and that matter was dismissed. Another significant challenge involved a constitutional amendment that was proposed for introduction, and this constitutional amendment was widely seen. If it had gone through, it was going to give the executive a lot of power. And that was challenged, but the court on technicality ruled that they had no jurisdiction over that matter. But thankfully, when that matter was put to a vote in Parliament, a 2/3 majority was required, and it didn't go through. So the point I'm making is sometimes in the life of a nation, certain institutions will be strong, others will be weak. But the strong institutions can also sometimes help to bring about the desired change. Again, I'll give an example from my country. During the last election, I think there was a lot at stake. People generally felt that the election might be rigged, and there were moments during the announcement of the election results when the Electoral Commission had to retreat for long hours because issues were being raised. But ultimately, despite all the pressure or the perceived pressure on the Electoral Commission, the government changed, and the current incumbent was able to beat his predecessor by more than 1 million votes. So for me, all these examples illustrate the fact that collectively, institutions and individuals can demand for the rule of law, even when certain other institutions may be compromised and are weak. So to really answer the question is, we are all key participants in enhancing, strengthening, and maintaining the rule of law. Thanks, Jeremy.
Just a quick follow-up, and then I'm going to bring Aisha Abdullah into the conversation. You've spent time reflecting on the strength of institutions. When there are weak institutions, what's the primer in terms of starting to strengthen them? Because that is a common problem across the continent, is it not?
Yes, indeed. I think the primary responsibility, as we've noted, is with government. But sometimes government does fail to push for the strengthening of the rule of law. And in that context, then other institutions, like the examples that I've given, depending on who's leading them, I find that it's primarily about the people that are leading these institutions and their personal values and ethics that drive them to insist on doing the right thing. So in an ideal event that government is not able to, private citizens, in my view, should mobilize and demand for a change. And sometimes, typically, this is done through the holding of democratic elections. But I want to say that sometimes just being able to change governments through a democratic process at the ballot may not be sufficient. And we've seen, like in Africa, a lot of countries do actually go to elections periodically, but it's not uncommon in Africa to see opposition parties crying foul and saying that elections may have been rigged and all. So elections themselves sometimes may not be a reflection of how democratic a country is, because they can be manipulated. The opposition can be suppressed. Sometimes we've seen it in many African countries, and a government in power can use the resources available to it to suppress and manipulate voters. So elections are important in a democratic dispensation, but elections themselves have to be free and fair. And additionally, we increasingly see that citizens sometimes, because they are the masses, they are the ones that are able to remove undemocratic governments or governments that do not respect the rule of law through the vote. But then this vote also has to be protected by a strong electoral commission. And I think, in my opinion, we saw that play out in our country the last couple of months in August.
Brenda, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's bring into this important conversation now Aisha Abdallah, a partner and head of disputes at Anjawala and Kana. You're a strong advocate of the rule of law, and particularly in your role as a patron of the Pro Bono Committee, all part of the ALN Academy, which promotes the rule of law in Africa. Quality legal training, Aisha, is something that you believe passionately about. Before we talk about that, let me throw two statistics at you from the survey. 6% of respondents believe that the provision of justice is equal in their home jurisdiction, just 6%. 40% of respondents believe that the rule of law would strengthen in their home markets across the next 5 years, perhaps a little bit more optimistic. So my question to you, Aisha, as I bring you into the conversation, and a very warm welcome, are you optimistic that the continent can reclaim respect, the high ground, as far as the rule of law is concerned?
Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. It's interesting that the statistics are slightly pessimistic. I think the first comment I'd make is that Africa is a huge continent with 54 countries. So I think the responses reflect where respondents are sitting. And I think in some countries, we're moving in the right direction, and in others, we're probably going backwards. On my part, I have to remain optimistic because if I didn't, I wouldn't continue to work hard in terms of capacity building and pro bono work. So I have to believe that what we're doing is actually going to result in meaningful change. And I think there's a basis for having this optimism. The first is because Africa is a very young population, and we have young people who are impatient to see the fruits of what they desire being achieved in their lifetime. And I think this is really important because we don't have a lot of complacency in our countries. And this is resulting in a push to change the way our societies work and change the status quo. The second reason is because we have had some really positive developments in Africa. And for example, in 2017, the Supreme Court in Kenya nullified the presidential election results, where the incumbent had won. This was the first time it's ever happened in Africa. It was only, I think, the third time it had ever happened in the world. And we actually went into a second round of presidential elections, and they were peaceful. And we managed to survive and progress. And that's really important to note. So we have some very positive examples. I think for me, the future is definitely African. We're seeing things like Africa asserting its cultural importance in the world of music, for example. And we're very innovative because we have a youthful population, we're dynamic, we have a lot of natural resources, and we're pushing for an increase in intra-Africa trade. So for me, the future is very much African. And because of that, I think there will be a number of reasons why rule of law continues to improve. I'm not sure I would say reclaim, because I'm not sure we've ever experienced true democracy in a number of countries. We have a legacy of colonialism, which isn't our fault. But I think certainly countries like Botswana, like Mauritius, they have a lot to be proud of.
Aisha, I want to pick up on 2 points that you have just raised, and you're so right when you talk about Africa being a continent of young people. And that is vital. And you talk about the pressure and the influence that they bring to bear on the debate. What sort of conversations are young Africans having in this respect? And to what extent are they making a difference? Are they creating a meaningful momentum, do you think?
I think that the first thing I would say is that the spaces these conversations take place in has changed. So we will see that young people are not necessarily engaging with traditional media, like the traditional newspapers, but they are having a lot of conversations in social media, in other spaces. And so I think that they have expanded the arenas for political dialogue because they've taken them to places they were not seen before. The other thing is that they are going to become, they are the new voting majority. So as long as there is a push to ensure that young people become registered as voters, we will see that their concerns become increasingly important for politicians to bear in mind. In Kenya, in Rwanda, we are seeing a lot of very young politicians entering the arena because they're not seeing their voices being heard. So they're seeing that they have to take part. And actually, some of them are doing really well. So I think, at least in the national parliament, we are seeing younger politicians. A lot of these started as student activists. So they're, I can't claim to speak for them, but I think that it's quite encouraging when you see these young people taking part in democratic elections.
Well, Aisha, if you look at me, I certainly can't claim to speak for them either, but I have huge respect for the contribution that they are making. You spoke about capacity building in this respect, and obviously there is a link to the work that the ALN Academy is doing in terms of quality legal training. Where are the gaps in that respect, and what type of accelerated legal training is needed, in your opinion, to further the acceleration of the rule of law?
I think there are gaps at both ends. So the first concern we have is that we are producing a lot of young law graduates, but they're not necessarily coming out with the skills that the market requires. So I think that the way that law is being taught is very theoretical, it's very abstract, it's not necessarily innovative. This is not an African problem. Legal institutions around the world are struggling to produce people who are innovative because of, law is a very conservative profession generally. So I think the challenge is that the future is the advances in technology mean the way we provide legal services will be demand-led and will change in many ways. And we can't do it in the same old way, which means we have to create lawyers who are naturally innovative and embrace technology. I think in many ways, lawyers are not seen to be innovative or embracing of technology. So for me, that's a big gap at the bottom end where people are entering, because the skills they will need are not necessarily what they're getting out of university. At the top end, I think there's a gap in terms of we in the academy are trying to make sure that government lawyers have the appropriate skills to negotiate good deals on behalf of their stakeholders, their citizens, when they're negotiating against people like the World Bank, against multilateral donors. So I think we see a skills gap there where essentially they are not necessarily equipped in technical areas to achieve the best results. And they're sort of, and that's a big concern, because a lot of these huge agreements they enter into have long-standing impact on their countries. So we do see a gap at both ends, at the senior end and also at the very young junior end, and both need to be addressed.
I'm going to bring our next panelist, Judith Kagere, into the conversation in just a moment. But Aisha, one more issue before I let you go. Just a quick answer, please. And you've bridged it nicely, because Judith is going to reference the importance of technology in this respect in just a moment. But you also spoke about there not being enough innovation when it comes to the legal profession. What did you mean by that?
So I think lawyers are still unfortunately being trained to come out and write and read long pieces, you know, long writings that are in, you know, using Latin that nobody's ever heard of or cares about, and make obscure points. And I think where lawyers need to remain relevant is that lawyers need to provide solutions to modern problems. So we have modern problems created by you know, innovations in terms of mobile money, you know, companies who are providing innovative services that are, you know, it's hard to even determine where some of these countries are located in a traditional sense of the word. Which country can assert jurisdiction over international companies? How do they assert this jurisdiction? Are the laws actually in place to allow us to regulate these very innovative challenges? And lawyers are supposed to have the answers to these problems, but lawyers don't even understand some of how this technology works. So there needs to be there needs to be a catching up from a technology side for lawyers, because unless they understand how the technology works, they can't possibly propose a solution.
And you've opened the conversation perfectly for Judith Kagere, who is going to join us now, Junior Associate at KTA Advocates. And this is the important part, and I shall get back to you in a moment, part of the firm's intellectual property, technology, media, and telecommunications and corporate commercial practice. Hello, Judith. It's nice to see you again. Tech as an enabler of the law. Given your experience in this environment that Aisha so eloquently outlined for us, what role then do you believe technology has to play in advancing the rule of law? And is it happening quick enough?
Well, firstly, what's important for all of us to remember is that the use of technology doesn't always translate into access to justice. And bridging that gap is what really would help everyone in the legal profession and all of us generally in dispensing justice to understand that all the strategies that we're laying out in employing technology to be able to dispense justice, that all these technologies that we are dispensing really are not going to work within just a vacuum. They're going to be used within our very communities, and enforcing practical ways in which this can be understood is very important. But it may not be going fast enough, but we're making very important strides, especially in the most vital areas of justice. For example, within the ministries, within the court procedures, we're having many more countries taking on electronic filings and also subsuming these into our civil and criminal procedure laws. We're seeing as more electoral regimes and elections come on, we're seeing very many justice systems actually making an effort and being intentional, training judges on, taking on electronic evidence, being able to take on witness statements that are electronic, how to assess the authenticity and admissibility of electronic evidence. And all these are the simple steps that they're taking towards access to justice. But not only that, but also having post-trainings, looking back at how, justice has been dispensed in these cases and looking what could they have done better, how could these proceedings have taken place better in a faster amount of time, how could this evidence maybe could have been accepted and said some parties, appeals and reviews of many of these court cases that have accepted electronic justice. But all those are the simple steps that we are taking. But what's important to know is that we're not where we are, where we wish we were, but we're not where we were when we began. I can say that at least for Uganda. But what's also important is that our legal culture needs to harness this technology, not just taking it on when it comes to the legislation, when technology is inputted into a legislation such as filing of summons and witness statements, but actually making active progressive steps towards within our law society, harnessing technology. How is it helping legal aid and pro bono, and how is it helping everyone in civil society, in the justice law and other sector within remote areas? Looking at it with a broad perspective can help us to understand how we can ultimately bridge the gap between dispensing justice and deploying technology.
So you make a very important point in terms of technology being an enabler of the rule of law, but it's also about making sure that there is a so-called level playing field, and in many parts of the continent, access to technology remains a problem and regrettably will be a problem in the foreseeable future.
Yes, that means that we're not just having that means we're not just having the justice system working independently or remote to every other system. We have to be intentional about putting technology deployment into our budgets. That way we'll be able to help to at least bridge the gap between those who can access the justice and those who cannot, because having all these legislation deployed, it doesn't make sense if somebody doesn't have a smartphone. How are they going to be able to serve these summons if somebody doesn't have a smartphone to capture electronic evidence, for example, bribery or assault and violence or bribery within an election? Then it doesn't, then these laws will be operating in a vacuum really. So all our governments have to be intentional about technology deployment and making very intentional steps to bridge the gap between dispensing justice and actually just deploying these technologies.
So budgets are critical as far as this is concerned. Access we have discussed. So what then is needed by legal firms in terms of skill set and consideration when it comes to a better adoption of legal technology? Where's the jump off point here?
Well, the jump off point will be within the legal firm. Within the law firm, we have to be intentional about how we set up our strategies in order to harness technologies. Are we going to take on legal tech to make our transaction work easier? That's one step. But then even the lawyers that we're hiring, are we making intentional steps towards training them so that they are able to understand, not to just take the law as brick and number, but understanding that the technology that we use in everyday life can actually help them to be able to help these clients. That also means continuous legal education for our lawyers, not just within the firm and professional development, but even within our own law societies, ensuring that we calendarize technology deployment and explaining harnessing of technologies and legal technologies, not only to lawyers who are actually in the specialty of technology, media, telecommunications, but all lawyers in general practice, that this is actually, something that is here for all of us, and it's something that can actually help us to serve our clients better. So it's within the law firm. That's why we all have to start within our own organization and looking at all the important strategic practice steps that we can take in order to help.
All right, Judith, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to widen the conversation now to the rest of the panel, and I'm looking at some of the key findings as far as the report is concerned. 3 points that I want to raise. One, relative to the rest of the world, Africa's rule of law is lagging, notwithstanding the optimism that Aisha brought into the conversation. Another key theme centered around respect for law and institution. And the most basic one, and the one that I found interesting but odd, was understanding what the rule of law means. And it's not straightforward, says the report. One definition: a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and community commitment that delivers accountability, just laws, open government, and accessible and impartial dispute resolution. As I said at the beginning of this conversation, those are all lofty ideals. Melanie, Ramalo, back to you. Do we have a problem if there's not a broad understanding of what the definition of the rule of law is?
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, in our opinion, we need to get to an alignment of what that means for the continent, for companies, for the government, so that we can work together. So from that perspective, having these sessions, sharing what the survey is saying, and certainly when we did the survey, we asked about the rule of law and what it means for the African continent as well as the South African continent. And it's exactly that: driving governance, getting out, ruling out corruption, putting down our compliance, and making sure that there's a fair justice system across the continent, but for all, for the people in the street, as well as government, as well as corporates and large multinationals. So I think if we all have that understanding, which is coming together, because it's been quite a topical discussion in the past 2 years across the globe as well. So yeah, that would be my few words to that question, Jeremy. Thank you.
Let me throw it to you now, Brenda. Do you think, as in taking it on from what Melanie says, do you think there is a greater understanding? I come, as far as definition is concerned, I come back to the report itself. Of the respondents who were asked what it means, only one phrase was repeated more than once: no one is above the law. It seems very basic and very obvious, but is it your understanding that we're starting to reach greater concordance when it comes to what understanding is? Because when there is broad cross-cultural, cross-economic, cross-country understanding, surely the component parts move better.
Jeremy, I would say that generally, at the societal level, my opinion is that people understand the rule of law to mean equality before the law. It's usually associated with equal dispensation of justice, human rights, constitutionalism, and all. But of course, it has to go beyond that. For me, the rule of law touches on, as has been mentioned by other panelists, how businesses behave, just certainty around the law, even as it relates to private contracts, investments, and all. So I think we need to have this broad understanding that the rule of law transcends just human rights. It also applies to interpretation of contracts and to everyday transactions, how the courts apply the law, not only to human rights, but also to other transactions. I'll give an example of the conversation that has been around in Zambia for the past week or so. So a concession was given to a large international mining company to basically mine in the national park, where there's wildlife and all. And there's been a huge outcry. And I think for me, the issues are, in that context, was the law followed in awarding this concession or giving the approvals, the necessary licenses from an environmental point of view? Was everything followed? And in that context, has the rule of law been applied? Because there is a law, of course, that requires that certain activities should not happen in certain areas. So such examples, and I think for me, the fact that we are having these conversations also, and ordinary citizens are involved, also suggests that there is an increasing awareness that people, multinationals investing in Zambia, need to follow the law and the laid down procedures and parameters within which their economic activities can be carried out. So
Mr. Abdullah, let me take the conversation in a slightly different direction if I can right now. I'm always cognizant of time. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't try to overlay the pandemic as far as the rule of law is concerned. Again, I come back to the report itself. I want to quote one private practice lawyer in Zimbabwe who says the pandemic has provided a blanket and a shield for people who are bent on infringing rights. A respondent in Malawi, a member of the judiciary, saying many cases have been delayed, understandable, hereby making it difficult for people to access justice when their rights have been violated. In your opinion, in what respect has the pandemic slowed the process of the rule of law across the continent? Aisha, that's a question that I am directing
was
at you.
that directed at me? Okay.
Indeed it was, yes.
Well, I don't agree it slowed progress. I think that COVID has had different effects in different parts of the country. So in Kenya, for example, initially we had a complete shutdown of our courts for 2 weeks. So then there was no access to justice, followed by a reopening of the courts, but only on a virtual basis. And actually what we found was the judges who are sitting at home were able to save time on commuting, and they were actually more efficient at home. So they delivered more rulings and judgments during the online period than they were doing before when it was physical access courts. So I don't agree that it's a blanket decrease or increase. I think it depends on what you're looking at. So obviously there are parts of the country where Wi-Fi connectivity is very poor. But those are the same parts of the country that, to be honest, don't even have physical court stations. So I think for the rural areas, COVID had a neutral effect on access to justice, and in the well-covered cities, actually in many ways improved access to justice by converting to online Teams hearings. And many of the judges, even now that the country has reopened and lifted restrictions, are still continuing to hold online hearings for all but maybe criminal matters. So my view is mixed.
And do you think that Aisha, is a trend that is here to stay, that we will see more of that type of approach to justice?
I think definitely what the government is doing is pushing digital transformation in all sectors, including in the judiciary. So there is a big push to improve ICT capabilities, to provide more remote access to certain services. So a lot of our government services were already going online, but then COVID just accelerated that push. So we're able to now apply for many of the government services online, like driving licenses and other things. So I think that push is not going to be reversed. I think what it's done is made a lot of us who are maybe reluctant to embrace technology realize that it's not a choice, it's actually just a requirement to engage in the modern world. You're just going to have to embrace this technology. And I don't think that's reversible. So even in the private sector, we're having to provide more flexibility to our employees because they now expect to be allowed to work part of the time remotely. So I think it's irreversible.
Judith, I saw you nodding your head when we spoke about the positive upside as far as technology has had in some centers when it comes to the dispensing of law. Again, it reinforces your point, does it not, about the power of technology to influence change. And in many respects, the pandemic might have, as Aisha has suggested, changed the paradigm, but also accelerated the process. Judith? I'm assuming there that she has frozen, so I am going to move on, folks. I want to get a sense, if we can, again, I want to come back to the rule of law and the hurdles as far as this report is concerned. Let me remind you of what they are again: corruption, government inefficiency, lack of transparency and accountability, lack of awareness, lack of motivation to change. Melanie, Ramalo, let me come back to you. It would be of deep concern to the legal profession that corruption still remains so endemic when it comes to the application of the rule of law, something that we simply can't get away from.
Yes, Jeremy, I hope I dropped for a few seconds. So I hope that
you're back with us. Thank you.
Okay, good. I caught the last part of what Jeremy was sharing with us. And it's an absolute must for us to take action. You know, a lot of our bodies are starting to, different bodies of associations are starting to drive and advance the rule of law globally, as well as in the Africa and South African continent. And Jeremy, you know, the Zondo Commission was published a few weeks ago, and we all deep dived into that, I think, 400-page report. And it really has highlighted where we need to just take action from a private sector perspective within our businesses as well, within large companies, within government, how to partner to help deliver the rule of law and to advance it across our continent and our country. And the Zondo report has certainly taught us a lot of insights they've given us around, you know, what is important within what we do from advancing the rule of law, what technology is available, what is available to us as organizations, but also as continents, and how to partner with our governments to help them to drive and advance the rule of law. And certainly it is time, and it has been, we've had, you and I have been part of associations saying that it's time to take action as private organizations, as citizens of our different countries, to drive and advance the rule of law. And certainly this platform makes that possible and very exciting for us. So I agree, it's time.
Brenda Chanda, again, how does the legal profession deal with this concern regarding corruption and its impact on the delivery of rule of law? What role, what further role, how can the legal profession raise its voice as far as this is concerned?
I mean, what I've seen happen in my country is that the Law Association of Zambia, which is the body that represents legal practitioners, has on many occasions raised challenges directly with the court on interpretation of the Constitution, where it's deemed that there's been a breach, but has also actively spoken out on issues of breach of the rule of law without necessarily going to court, and has also sought audience with the relevant authorities and raised issues with them. So in that sense, collectively, the association that represents lawyers has been able to do that. But we've also seen individual lawyers speak up against what they perceive to be injustices or breaches of the rule of law in their individual capacity. But my view is that in my country and in various African countries, the legal profession needs to do more to mobilize and speak as one voice in matters relating to the rule of law.
But Brenda, often speaking out and mobilization, as you put it, can have very dangerous consequences.
Yes, indeed, it's a risk, but history shows us that unless someone or certain sectors of the country are willing to take that risk, sometimes it comes at a very high cost, depending on where you are in the continent. And we've seen that even in our country, individuals that have spoken out have been subjected to all sorts of attacks, sometimes on the internet, sometimes to their own personal security. But like one particular individual, Linda Kasonde, who is heading Chapter 1 Foundation, she's been very vocal. And I think for me, coming into this new government after August, she was vindicated, because most of the issues that she raised, the general population in the end agreed with her, and this was shown in the election results. So yes, a lot of people will shy away because it comes at a cost. Sometimes it's a cost to your own life and to your own personal security, but someone has to do it.
Judith Kagere, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm back with you, Jeremy.
Excellent, that's fine. Let's move on. I'm glad that you have rejoined the conversation. We're talking about the biggest hurdle facing the application of rule of law across the continent, and head and shoulders above the rest, it is corruption. What is your understanding of that? And again, what role can technology play, do you think, in combating this particular problem?
Well, it is true that corruption is the biggest battle that we have to face for access to justice, because corruption eats up everything. It's up everything throughout the red tape, the entire value chain of dispensing justice. It goes straight from the ministries, all government stakeholders, down to the common man at the grassroots level. So I definitely agree that understanding corruption is important for us to be able to fight it, but it's not a fight that we can do single-handedly as the legal profession or single-handedly as government. It's a fight for all citizens, and it's a fight for all Africans, in order for us to be able to share ideas, insights into how corruption has been fought within the different countries, and then maybe we can have comparative studies and discuss together. When you try and fight this thing alone, then you realize you begin to repeat the mistakes that other people made, or you begin to repeat the wrong strategies that failed to different countries. And then on the side of technology, as I said before, doesn't operate in a vacuum. Technology is dispensed within our legislation, within our laws. But what can help in fighting corruption is that within our structure of the judiciary, for example, we're going to have the court systems be able to employ technology to be able to, one, help with access to justice, but also help to clean up the system. Technology helps with faster filings of documents. You do not have court files getting lost. You do not have court files disappearing, and all these problems that are very common in all our jurisdictions. Technology would help with that, because if you have something that has been placed on a public register because of technology, then you're going to fight issues of bribing of judges, bribing of court clerks, adjournments that are unnecessary. They're really just causing, frustration within the system. So those are the ways in which technology can help that we have now. But if we're looking at it long term, then we're having our ministries of justice be able to look at technology not just as a tool they can use, but as an important, something that's important for them to deploy within the sector to enable access to justice, and not just something that they can cherry pick and only apply when it's passed into legislation. So that's how technology can help us, to fight corruption that we are facing now.
Aisha, I'm going to let you weigh in on the issue of corruption, and then I'm going to come back to the panel members for some closing remarks. But Aisha, do you have a unique view on how this issue can be handled, how we can ratchet it down slightly as we go forward?
Just a couple of comments. What we found, like in Kenya and East Africa, is that governments are importing legislation from other parts of the world to fight corruption. So in Kenya, we have something a bit similar to the UK Bribery Act, which is in place. And we find this trend across the region. And I would just urge legislators to be cautious about simply cutting and pasting laws from outside of the continent, because often these laws need to be adapted to the local circumstances. Otherwise, they won't work. So they need to sort of take account of local context and culture, and you simply can't just import like a US law and expect it to work, for example, in Kenya. So that the first thing is that local context is really important in understanding corruption. The second thing we have found is that there's no point tackling low-level corruption, which we all experience every day, if you're not going after some big fish. So what's happened now is, at least over the last 2-3 years, we are finding that regulators going after some high-profile, well-known individuals, some of whom have been convicted of corruption. And this is having a much wider impact than simply arresting some low-level people. So I think it's important to target limited resources and go after the big fish who ultimately steal a lot more money than a handful of low-level people. And then the third thing I was going to say, and it was sort of to address the question you asked Judith, is that technology is neutral. It is not pro-democratic or anti-democratic. It's not pro-rule of law or anti. Technology is a tool that can be used for good and bad. In Kenya, we have seen technology being touted as the answer to corruption in terms of very expensive systems that are supposed to track voters and prevent voter fraud and to prevent the misuse of public resources. And these tools have been undermined from the inside. So as Judith, I think, has tried to say, technology is neutral. There isn't such a thing as technology is the answer to corruption. People are the answer to corruption. Values are the answer to corruption. Technology is just a tool. If I want to be corrupt, I'll use the technology to be corrupt. And if I don't want to be corrupt, I'll use the technology to promote transparency. So I think there might be a myth out there that there's some technological solution. We have seen in the West that very sophisticated Western governments are unable to control these technological powers like Amazon. So I think that we need to look at our culture and our values, and then we need to target very limited resources at those big fish who steal all our money.
Aisha, thank you very much indeed. And as I come to the end of this conversation, I'm going to reference a paragraph in the survey which says that it makes it clear that advancing the rule of law in Africa is complex. I think there is general agreement as far as that is concerned. And there's also agreement that it's not uniform across all jurisdictions. But the survey concludes, for the most part, the awareness and motivation to improve is there. To Aisha's point about optimism, the difficulty is how to make that happen. How to make that happen. That's what I want to end this conversation with today. And Melanie, Ramalo, LexisNexis in South Africa, let's come back to you for your closing remarks. The rule of law is there. The difficulty is to how to make that happen. How do we make it happen, Melanie?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the panelists. I think it's key, like Aisha is saying, that we have to drive a culture of making it happen. And it's certainly in South Africa, as an example, the president has got a fraud and corruption unit from the top down to start looking at these officials as well as other tips that they're getting to rule out non-compliance to the rule of law and setting the path for the country from the top down. It's the same within our organizations. It's the top-down, bottom-up approach. And Aisha is on point with she said, it's a culture, it's about our values, and that's what makes us so exciting about what LexisNexis' vision is around advancing and growing the potential of advancing the rule of law in Africa and South Africa, and the values that underpin that from an innovation perspective, customer-centric, putting our people at the heart of everything we do. And if we have the right values and we drive that as the cultural aspect into the organization, technology can be used smartly to drive it, and it can help us drive it faster. It gives us, and globally, and gives us access in a faster way than what we had before in driving what we want to drive from advancing the rule of law. So parting words, that's my end to this awesome conversation. And thank you for sharing in the survey with us as well as delegates and countries within the continent, Jeremy. So thank you to you.
Melanie, thank you very much indeed. And back to Aisha's point about technology remaining neutral in all of this, I think that is such an important point. Brenda Chanda, let's get some closing remarks from you in terms of what's next when it comes to the accelerated application of the rule of law.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think for me, I want to point out and agree with Aisha when she says that Africa is a huge continent made up of 54 countries, and these countries have their own unique characteristics, their own unique historical background. And I think we can't have uniform standards for every country. the rule of law in other countries is easier to implement, I think, for me, with the right leadership. But we see some very entrenched issues in other countries that need to be handled more deeply and more carefully. So for instance, the conflict in Ethiopia, I mean, when you listen to the documentaries on Ethiopia, you realize that it's very entrenched, it's very tribal, and those issues do not just go away, you know, by having a few mediators here and there. The international community, the regional blocs, and whoever is mediating these conflicts have to really dig down to the issues and find lasting solutions. And in those countries, the rule of law may not come as easily as in other countries. Same thing with Sudan. I mean, we saw the peace hold up for a few years, but because the issues are largely unresolved, the tensions between different factions in society and different interest groups, we've seen Sudan again slide back into conflict. So we need to look at the individual countries, identify their unique problems, and apply different solutions to them. We see again the conflict that is in Cameroon. It's largely between the English-speaking side and the French-speaking side, very historical, obviously dating back to the colonial days. So all those issues need to be handled differently. So we can't have a blanket solution, but we need to be committed to the rule of law, because there is a strong correlation between the rule of law, as has been pointed out, and economic development. Right. And Africa needs to take advantage of its great potential and strengthen the rule of law to see the resulting economic development and prosperity.
Brenda, thank you very much indeed. And that nexus between economic development and the rule of law is something which is so critical. Aisha and Judith, I'm going to ask you please to keep your closing remarks very, very brief, because unfortunately time is running fairly sharply against us. Judith, let's hear your final thoughts.
Well, I think I'll borrow from one of the points that Aisha made. It's just important that we all collaborate together and, you know, avoid these issues that you have of duplicating laws or having laws, you know, transported from one country and then transplanted into another. And when they're not applicable, you have specific procedures that are not working for a particular community. And then you have, you know, the law being helpless really towards access to justice. And that again, you know, it becomes a rolling stone that defeats everything else in the system. So we need to go back to the drawing board in our collaboration and look at what actually sincerely works, what doesn't work for us, and how we can move forward as individual countries, but all together as a continent for the common problems that we share and for whatever is individualistic to each of us.
With the understanding, as you've all said, that the rule of law is not uniform across all jurisdictions. Aisha, back to you very quickly for a few remarks, and then I'm going to hand over to Winston.
Yes, it's a conundrum that the rule of law is so much wider than the laws in a country. And I think I go back to my point that for me, I don't think legislation necessarily addresses a lot of the underlying problems that Brenda mentioned, maybe Judith mentioned. So as much as we talk about improvement of rule of law, we mustn't be fixated on the fact that improvement must come from legislation or improvement can only come from lawyers. Improvement in rule of law is much more holistic, and it goes down to really basic values like who are the role models that our children look up to, and what is our society essentially teaching our young people in terms of what does success mean. If success means that you drive a fancy car in Kenya, then naturally you will gravitate to politics for the wrong reasons, actually. So I really don't like sound bites. I don't want to belittle the topic. I think it will remain complex and nuanced, and that we don't want to undermine the discussion by pretending that there is some sort of easy solution. There isn't. That's why it's entrenched and endemic. But I think the fact that we have these type of discussions across countries is really useful, and we should promote maybe the sharing of best practices across Africa and not necessarily from outside the continent.
Aisha Abdallah, thank you very much indeed. And I extend my thanks to all the panel members. And I couldn't agree with you more that if you have a cross-country conversation as far as this is concerned, it will certainly add, albeit incrementally, to the debate as far as improvement is concerned. Winston Boykutso, Head of African Partnerships at LexisNexis. Over to you, sir, as we close this webinar.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Wow, what an insightful discussion, really incisive and thought-provoking, discussion and ideas coming forward. I want to thank you first, Mr. Jeremy Maggs, for a wonderful job that you've done for us. You are truly, truly a national treasure when it comes to what you do. You always equal to the task.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, quite some insights coming up. I'm mindful that that we are out of time. Just to say that the African Rule of Law report can be downloaded at LexisNexis.co.za. Very insightful, thoughts coming from members of the panel. Notably from Melanie, that the potential of our continent can really be enhanced through making sure that the rule of law is in place. And I mean, the rule of law also speaks to policy certainty and the assurance that when there's a rule of law, there's ability to attract FDIs, foreign direct investment. And when investors are assured that their investments are safe and they can yield a return, then that will always ensure that the nation is also benefiting from active economic participation. I think you wrapped up some of the key points. Aisha, you spoke about the importance of the participation of the youth and the fact that the African continent is largely youthful. So, and the importance of training of members of the legal fraternity, both at law firm level and at law society level. So, and the neutrality of technology, that it can be used for both good and bad. I would like to really thank our esteemed panelists, for your time today and your insights. You can look out for the recording, post-event via our email or our social media channels, and also look out for our upcoming webinars on LexisNexis.co.za. That will come up now on the screen. And also to say that we have, our Africa division at LexisNexis is open for business. We have in-house experts who are ready to welcome you and guide you to navigate the technological landscape that is applicable to the legal fraternity. You can reach out to us through sales@LexisNexis.co.za. We will continue to establish partnerships with like-minded entities like Africa Legal. Thank you so much, Africa Legal. So that we can continue to enable the private and the public sector to navigate, the fluid nature of the African legal and regulatory landscape. So we really trust that you've enjoyed today's discussions, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for making the time.